Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations. So today, Kristina, we're going to address something that we've been thinking about and talking about a lot because mental health is always a component of our podcast. And since the pandemic, it's really shed a light on mental health issues that we've addressed from a number of angles, but we really haven't talked about suicide. So today's guest, we're going to talk about suicide prevention, screening, assessment, intervention, and post-vention.
This is a topic that, while September marked National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, this episode unfortunately won't be released in September, but it's a really important discussion that's relevant year-round. And so we wanted to invite today's guest to examine this topic with us. Suicide's the second leading cause of death for college students. And
again, it's a topic that sadly that has affected and impacted our practice. And although we are not mental health professionals, we make a lot of referrals. And sadly, we have dealt with the issue in some of our cases.
So today we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Heath Hightower, who is the Senior Director of Suicide Grief Support Services at Samaritans in Boston.
And just to interrupt, he's also recently became a doctor. So congratulations, Heath. And just as recently, my brother-in-law.
Well, there you go.
There you go. So I thought I'd add that in.
Well, let me keep bragging. Dr. Hightower holds a doctorate in counseling and psychology and a master's degree in social work. His clinical work has also included outpatient substance abuse counseling, private independent high school counseling, and community college counseling.
Basically, our population.
That's right. Dr. Hightower's research and scholarly writing has focused on suicide in the Black and African American communities and reframing the suicide as a social justice issue.
Welcome.
Welcome to you as well. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're really pleased to have someone who is so knowledgeable and works with this population. The number one question, I think, for every parent is, what are the signs? And in particular, if you're a parent, how do you separate depression, anxiety from thinking that it's actually a suicide risk?
Yeah, so you're asking a really important question, Susan, and it doesn't have a very simple answer, unfortunately. So one of the things that I think is important for parents to hear, especially parents who are parents in the United States, is that you are all in what I like to call the American parent trap, which really means that there is this cultural expectation that you are going to be the expert in every aspect of your child's life, and therefore should have some sort of special, almost clairvoyant ability to predict when your child is going to be thinking about suicide, maybe planning a suicide, and maybe attempting suicide. And I think that that trap sets a really unrealistic expectation around suicide screening and assessment, especially when moms and dads are trying to do that, and they're not trained professionals to do that. So I want to just start off by saying to moms and dads out there that there are unrealistic expectations on you about your ability to predict your child's suicide. The other, I think, cultural piece that we have to also understand is that suicide is preventable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all suicides can be prevented. And so I think it's important to say that out loud because it is possible for anybody to do or say all of the technically right things and still have an outcome that is a death by suicide. So that doesn't mean our power.
Pill to swallow.
Yeah, that's a hard truth, but I think an important truth.
Yeah.
Well, this is called real talk for a reason.
That's right. That's right.
So let's talk really about this then. So given that reality, there still are things that we can know. And when we know them, we can respond in a particular way. So the challenge, though, is that a lot of the indicators, the suicide risk factors and warning signs can also be indicators and warning signs of other things, right? Unless your child comes to you and says, Mom, Dad, mom, foster dad, grandma, whoever is serving in that parental role, I am thinking about dying by suicide, and here's how I'm going to do it, and here's when I'm going to do it. If a child doesn't do that, anything short of that is going to require you to do some follow-up and to notice some things that are going on in your child's life, and then follow up by asking about that. So let me just give you a concrete
I
example.
was going to say, what do you want to
What are the
notice?
specifics that maybe parents should be on the lookout for?
Yeah.
Or whatever.
So a lot of the warning signs are expressing a desire to die. Certainly, if your child is deleting their social media accounts, if they are getting into fights with people that they don't usually get into fights with, anger and rage at people that they don't usually get rageful at. So it's one thing for them to be pissed off at you. It's another thing for them to be pissed off at grandma and to call her all sorts of obscene names, right? That's really different. I think also if we start seeing our kids engaging in high-risk behaviors like increased substance use, driving the car really fast, engaging in high-risk sexual activities, all of that impulsivity stuff, if we see an increase in their usual impulsive behaviors, which again can be relatively typical for adolescents and young adults, if we start seeing that in greater proportions, those are the warning signs that moms and dads and coaches and administrators and teachers really should be on the lookout for and pull the student aside and have a conversation.
Should parents just confront it head on? I mean, that would be my MO. Are you thinking about this? I've noticed.
Yeah, so I think you're raising a really good point about addressing it head on. I think the question isn't whether you should directly confront it head on. It's really how you do it. So I think the approach is important. I think if you barge into little Johnny or little Susie's room and say, hey, what the hell's going on? Are you thinking about dying by suicide? I think you're going to get a pretty defensive answer, which is no, not at all, right? But if, on the other hand, you knock on little Johnny and Susie's door, you ask for permission to come in, and you say, little Johnny or Susie, here's what I've noticed. Can you help me understand what's going on? And then really, really listen, right? Without responding. Hear them out fully, and then express what your concern might be, right? So if your concern is, gosh, I've noticed you're not sleeping. I noticed that, you're not talking to your friends. You've skipped gymnastics or you've skipped track practice. Can you help me understand what's going on? And if little and Johnny say, well, here's what's going on, depending on what's actually going on, that then should guide mom and dad's next reaction or response.
So that's really helpful to hear. And it sounds like at the heart of it, an essential thing for parents or loved ones to do is listen really carefully. But my question for you is this. You mentioned when we first started talking, short of the child, the teen, the college student coming out and saying, I'm contemplating dying, or even in the conversation along the lines of what you recommended now. My question is this: how often are young adults actually honest and forthright about what their thoughts are?
You took the question. I thought of it at the same time. I mean, I would assume if someone's planning this, don't they lie and want to cover it up? That's what I was
Or
thinking.
how often do young
Sure.
adults actually come right out and say, here's what I'm thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, in my experience, if you ask someone directly and their response is, no, 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 then I think the follow-up question is, gosh, I'm hearing the no, 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 and yet I'm seeing these signs. Can you help me understand the disconnect between the no, 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 and what I'm seeing? And so again, this is really about gently redirecting that you've heard what they've said. No, 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 that's not what I'm thinking. And at the same time, you're also pointing out that there's this disconnect between what they're saying, how they're saying it, and what else is going on. So if they say no, 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 then again, the question, the rejoinder, the follow-up is, can you help me understand what made you decide to delete your email accounts or your social media accounts? What made you decide to not go to practice today? What made you decide to drop out of the school play? What made you decide to drive your car at 80 miles an hour in a 20 mile an hour speed zone? So I think that kind of going back and checking in will give the child a sign, or your student a sign, that you really want to know, that it's not a one and done. I asked you, you said no, I walked away.
An accusation.
Right. And it's not an accusation either, right? It really is, I'm here, I'm concerned, I need to know what's going on. And the story that you're telling me doesn't make sense to me. And so I need you to help me make sense of this, because I love you, I care about you, and I don't want anything bad to happen to you. And
instinct, Heath, is that's a lot of pressure on parents. So
yeah,
would you
yeah.
agree that if a parent has any doubt, what's wrong with just having the child or the student screened by a mental health professional? And if so, how reliable are those screens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one of the things you have to think about is, are you forcing the kid to go, or is the kid going because they want to go talk to the mental health professional? I think we all know that if we try to make our teens and our young adults do things that they don't want to do, they're pretty skilled at telling adults, even trained clinicians, what they think the trained clinician wants to hear, right? And so I think that while I understand that your question is implying this is putting a lot of pressure on moms and dads to figure this out themselves, it's
right?
Right. It's true. But it's also true that you are likely to know your child and have a better relationship with your child than anybody else in their life that is an adult. Now, there may be a coach, there may be a teacher that they would feel more comfortable with. And in that case, you might want to enlist that adult's help to try to get the screening done. So I think that your other question is also, to what degree are these screening tools effective, right? So so I think that a couple of things depends on whether they're effective or not. One thing that determines effectiveness is, has the student or child been screened before, right? So if a child already knows what the questions are and what the consequences may be if they say yes to a specific question, then they may be less likely to be forthcoming, right?
Fear of being put in a hospital?
Yes.
Or put
exactly.
in a wilderness program or an
Yes.
alternative therapeutic environment. They're going to game it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But do the screening measures have a built-in means to look for malingering or manipulation or something like that? Or
No.
perhaps not? Okay,
No.
interesting.
No. I mean, again, screenings are about yes or no. Is someone positive or negative for suicidality? I mean, and again, a screening interview is built for efficiency. It's built to be administered in less than a minute. It's all yes or no questions. And
You make that assessment in 1 minute with yes and no?
Less
Yeah.
than
Less than 1 minute.
Yeah.
That's
I
like
think
blowing my mind.
yeah. So I think it's important to differentiate between screenings and assessments. So a screening
Oh, okay.
is, yeah. So in professional parlance, screening is a brief tool simply to determine whether or not there is what probability that a person has a particular experience. In this case, we're talking about to what degree or to what probability does a child or an adult or a youth, how probable is it that they're suicidal right this very second? If they test positive, which is to say there is a real high likelihood that they are experiencing some form of suicidality, then the next step would be to do a much more thorough assessment.
So I'm just thinking through parents who might have a great relationship with their student or child, or maybe not. And, a follow-up question is, when should they get screened? But I think it sounds like real sudden changes in behavior. I mean, is that fair? I'm thinking about before when you said getting off of social media, driving fast, the impulsivity.
If you know they're driving fast.
Right,
I mean,
right.
you're
And that,
assuming.
again, is assuming a lot of knowledge that, as
Sure.
we see in our practice, there's many parents out there, and I don't say this with judgment, but just
Sure.
as a matter of observation, who don't have any clue.
Yes.
what's
Or
going
the
on.
last to know.
Right, right.
Yes.
So, I mean, can you be a little more specific on when a student should be screened or assessed?
Well, I think the shortest answer is when mom and dad are concerned.
I like
Right.
that.
Fair. Yeah. That seems to make good sense. So a follow-up question as well that I had
Sure.
is, what can you tell us about any correlation between substance abuse and suicide, particularly among the student young adult population?
Which is, I just want to follow up when we deal with our college kids.
Yeah.
Most of them are using some form of recreational drug or
Sure.
alcohol use.
Yeah. So there's a strong correlation, right? One of the risk factors is, of course, substance use. And again, the substance use does two things potentially to increase that risk. It disinhibits people, so it increases the probability of impulsivity, and at the same time, people often use substances to self-medicate. So they are also using a substance as a form of self-treatment for an underlying mental health condition, or to manage their stress, or to manage the anxiety they might feel about performing at the track meet or at the football game or at the volleyball tournament or the test they have to take the next day. And if they're using alcohol, which is in and of itself a central nervous system depressant, that's going to compound the depressive feelings that they might be having. So there's a strong association.
Heath, school just started.
Yes,
And
it did.
homesickness, especially for freshmen,
Yep.
is normal.
Yes.
But it's really scary when your kid might be across the country or in the next state and you don't see your student every day and you get the call, I'm homesickness, I'm lonely. How do you know when you should get in the car and go see your kid, or even say, you know what, maybe it's time to come home, and maybe you weren't ready? Because we actually do see a lot of cases where kids really, especially since the pandemic, are struggling. And, parents tend to say, well, maybe they should just tough it out or go see the
Things will
counselor.
settle in a couple weeks.
Yeah, we've heard that. So what's the point where you say, you know what, I got to go. Got to get in the car, get on that plane.
Yeah. So I think that if you are noticing a frequency of texts and calls from your kid, and again, different parents and children have different frequencies with which they communicate with their children. So I would say that if you're starting to notice kind of increased phone calls, increased texts, and the theme of those are, wow, this is really hard. Wow, this is really overwhelming. Gosh, I really miss my bed. Gosh, I really miss mom's cooking. gosh, I really miss the dog Spot. I think that that's probably the time to have a conversation about whether or not this is a good fit or not, right?
And
I,
communication is very different from family to family. I know
yes,
in my own family, it's been very interesting because my husband and his daughter will communicate mostly by text and maybe a phone call once a week,
right,
where how many times do my kids call me?
right,
Many, many,
right.
many times per child per day.
Yeah.
Yes,
It is
right.
a
Yeah,
running conversation. And
yeah.
also, my kids, I tend not to hear from them when they're happy. When they're
Yeah,
miserable, they dump on
Well,
me.
that I was going to make
yeah.
that ask
That's right.
sort of the follow-up idea about perhaps frequency of calls, texts, whatever, increasing or decreasing. Maybe if it's a
Sure.
very communicative family and then your
Right.
child starts to withdraw or pull away, that
Right.
perhaps is a sign for parents as well.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah. 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 And I think along with frequency is also the content of that communication. Like if most of the communication is about sadness and like they've not made any friends and school is really hard and, they eat by themselves in the dining hall every night and, they aren't doing the typical college engagement things like joining clubs or, meeting new people and going to lectures or whatever it is. If all you're really hearing is how miserable the experience is, how negative it is, how hard it is, I think I think it's important to pay attention to the content of the themes of what's being communicated as well as the frequency.
So let's take it a step further. There's
Sure.
a shift in communication between student and parent,
Yep.
such that parents or loved ones say, "Okay, let's go visit. Let's get in the car and go," as Susan said.
Yep.
After you have that visit, and let's say the communication that seems a little off continues on, what
Mhm.
guidance or I guess food for thought can you offer for parents who are wrestling with that decision of maybe is it time for my child to come home versus just having, I don't want to say just, I'm not trying to minimize, but
Sure.
coming home versus working with on-campus mental health
Mhm.
counselors?
Which,
Right.
might I add, is not always so accessible. We've learned that too.
Well,
Yeah.
particularly in our pandemic world
Yeah.
now.
It's not
Right.
always easy to get a counselor.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things. One thing that I think I would say about the how do moms and dads discern between when to bring them home, when to have them stay, when to try to access resources locally wherever their child is going to college, again, probably needs to involve the student because now we're talking about college age folks who are 18 years or older, probably.
And maybe who don't sign a release for their parents to be in the loop, right?
That's right. Exactly. That's a whole other kettle of fish. So in those instances where your child may not be communicative, they've kind of cut you out of the loop. I think the thing to do to both be respectful as well as to be proactive is to let your student, your college student know, we're worried about you. We're not hearing from you. We're going to be in touch with the hall director, with your RA, with your coach, with
That's
your,
practical.
right, exactly. And again, I think it's really always important for moms and dads to frame this as we love you, we care about you, and we want you still here.
Heath, every family has had a conversation about death, whether it's,
Sure.
God forbid, a dog, a pet, a
Mhm.
grandparent. And I would say the topic of suicide comes up, and there are religious beliefs about it. But
Yep.
what is a healthy family narrative, would you say, for parents to message, along with obviously that this is not something that should ever be an option? This is something that there's always a better path. There's always, the rainbow. But what is a real way to message this on a family position?
I think one of the things about the moment that we're living in right now is that we see and hear suicide in the lyrics of music much, much more than we used to. We are seeing television shows and Netflix specials that are kind of focused on suicide. Characters on television shows, kind of central characters oftentimes, have died by suicide.
Kristina, that teen show that just came out about the topic, was it
13 Reasons Why?
Yeah.
On a couple years ago, and it was
Yeah.
incredibly popular, and I think hopefully opened a pathway for some conversations in families. But
So-
what are your thoughts, Heath?
Anytime the topic of suicide enters the popular cultural conversation, that's the entry point. That's the place to say, gosh, I just heard that there's this TV show on Netflix called 13 Reasons Why. Have you heard about that? And if they say, no, I've not heard about it, then, I would probably say, well, gosh, your mom and dad and I were flipping through Netflix and we saw this show and we thought we'd watch the first episode. And it made us realize that we've never had a conversation with you and your brothers and sisters about suicide. And, as your mom and dad, part of our responsibility is to help prepare you for the world. We'd really like to talk to you about that and wonder what you and your friends might be talking about or thinking about as it relates to suicide, and kind of open it up as a conversation that way.
I think that's great advice. I like that. Just approach stuff not so much as a didactic moment, but rather, hey, I saw this on the news. Let's have a conversation and sort of see where it goes.
What age developmentally do students understand that death is permanent? Because I don't even think they process that in college, because we see so much suicide.
Yeah.
What is it? Contagion?
Yeah. So that when in doing some reading and sort of getting thoughts in order for today, we came across this phrase that I hadn't really heard, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it.
I think I did.
Contagion. What is this phenomenon, or what does that refer to?
And if you could answer the other question, when will students know it's permanent?
Yeah.
Go.
No, that's okay. So I'll try to take the questions in the order in which they came. So the age question, I think, is really interesting because it's not just what chronological age is your child, it's what developmental age are they at. We know, for example, that abstract thinking, which is something that typically starts emerging in adolescence, is probably when people start beginning to fully grasp what that is. But again, it's a process of learning what that is. It's not a one day you have no idea what death is, the next day you do know. I think depending on when a family has had pets, if you have pets in your house when your children are fairly young, those pets will likely die when your children are still fairly young. So the topic of death.
We had a deceased fish in my house last year. Sorry to interrupt you, but it was
okay.
It was a very significant event in our household.
I still remember when my goldfish, Mr. Limpet, died.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember. It was bad. Bad moment.
And again, there may be pieces of you that don't fully understand why the fish died. You're not willing or able to fully grasp that just yet.
Sure. Well, it was, kidding aside, it really was a developmentally significant event for my son in particular. And so, my husband and I are kind of chuckling about the fish that, didn't make it because, these fish. But it was, it was a significant event that was an opportunity for a lot of discussion. And so it's
the discussion on death versus suicide. It's a different discussion, isn't it?
Yes. And primarily because in our culture, we have two categories of death, good deaths and bad deaths. And suicide throughout human history, especially in our culture, has always been considered a very bad death.
That's interesting to separate it out. We have, Heath, we're almost at the hour, and I feel like we haven't even gotten through half our outline.
No. I have one question that I think is really important for
Sure.
our listeners. When there is an issue of suicide, on campus, how can students support each other after the death of a classmate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the thing to remember is that simply being present and available to people is probably the most supportive thing. I think as someone who spends every single day of his professional life right now talking to individuals and families who have lost someone to suicide, I more than anybody else know that there's no magic words that I say because there's nothing magic I can do to bring their loved one back. The thing I can offer people, though, is my presence, my willingness to listen to their story, to be patient, to answer their questions as openly and honestly as I know how to. And when I don't know the answer to something, I don't try to bullshit my way through it. I simply will say, I don't know the answer to that question. That's an excellent question. Let's try to figure that out together. I think the one thing that I always want to convey is that no one should grieve alone when it comes to a death by suicide. And because of the stigma around suicide, many families, many individuals do grieve by themselves because there is so much stigma around a death by suicide. Individuals and families are afraid that others will blame them for their loved one's death.
Well, I love concluding with the message that nobody should grieve alone, because that is definitely the most compassionate approach that we can take. And that is real talk and a message that everybody needs to just pause on and reflect. Heath, thank you. I can't say I enjoyed this conversation because it's painful even listening to it, but it's an important conversation for us to have.
Indeed, Dr. Hightower, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.